Good morning, everybody. Warm welcome, everyone, to our Bravo 22 live programme and our YouTube channel, made possible by the Royal British Legion and the Drive Project. My name is Van Roy Heflin Barratt, known as Baz, and I'm your co-host for this session. I first got involved with Bravo when I took part in a theatre production called Reparation Island at the Birmingham Hippodrome Theatre. It was a real challenge. It took me out of my comfort zone. I've also been involved in some of the previous online sessions, and I'm currently taking part in a theatre skills course via Zoom. What's more, Bravo 22 Live offers top quality artists sharing their insights with you across a huge range of creative skill areas, chatting to you live straight into your home. Here's the thing, why not give your military friends and family a big shout out about Bravo 22 Live and get them to subscribe to the channel and to like and share on Facebook. During this session, there's a live chat space for you to ask questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. If the urge takes you, get writing. I'm really excited to introduce to you Adam Russ, an extremely talented writer, director and coach who has worked for the National Theatre for many years with a special focus on storytelling. A real treat to have him with us. Good morning, Adam.
Good morning, Baz. Thank you for having me. Absolute pleasure to be here. So thank you, Bravo 22 audience. What we're going to be doing today is we're going to be getting into the mechanics of story. So what that means is often new writers or people who think, oh, I've got an idea, but I need the muse to catch me. Actually, today we're going to take a really practical approach to how you build a story and take an idea that you might have and turn it into a narrative. So this is something you can take part in at home. If you've got post-it notes, brilliant. If not, you can just do it on a piece of paper, or you can just watch and let the ideas ferment in your head. We're going to be using a story as a kind of example or a template, which Baz has selected for us. What's the story you've selected for us today, Baz?
I've selected Small Island by Andrea Levy.
Okay, what made you choose Small Island?
Well, the story resonates with me in a myriad of ways, really. To a certain extent, it charts my parents' journey and also has elements of my own. It's set during and after World War II. Many ex-servicemen from the Commonwealth who fought for Britain were invited to come back and help rebuild the mother country. And in part, they were known as the Windrush generation.
Okay, so there's a military connection to this story, which is perfect for the audience we've got this morning, which is lovely. So what we're going to do is we're going to take Small Island, but we're also going to help you build your own story, and we're going to use 3-act structure. Now, if you haven't heard of 3-act structure, if you've never come across that phrase before, I'd be surprised. But the great thing about 3-act structure is even if you don't think you know what 3-act structure is, you probably do. Now, before we dive into the mechanics of 3-act structure, there's a couple of things to just bear in mind. The first thing is, whatever story you're choosing to write, whatever narrative you're embarking on, all stories are joined by one thing. They are always about change. So change is at the heart of any story. Even a story you might tell to a friend or a family member, if there isn't an element of change in it, it's not a story, and they probably won't be very interested. So that's the first thing. Change is absolutely key. The second thing to bear in mind is there are lots of books on storytelling structure. You'll find lots of guides online. There are no hard and fast rules. So what I'm going to share with you today are principles. It's important to bear in mind that if you're following the rules of a story or what you've been told are the rules, you'll probably come up with something predictable and not very interesting. So for that reason, 2 key words to bear in mind are or not. So if you hear me talk about principle and I say, well, heroes have to be like this, yes, or not. So in order to be innovative and exciting storytellers, as much as possible, think about ways you can bend and break the principles, by all means. Right, so with that in mind, let's dive into Act 1. So what happens in Act 1 of a story typically? Well, I'm going to share some elements which we often find in Act 1 of a story. So in Act 1, typically we will meet our characters. We will also be introduced to the world which our characters occupy, so we'll define the setting. We'll be introduced to the rules of that world. If you set your story in the Middle Ages, there will be certain social rules and customs which your characters need to abide by. Magical items, if there are things in your story world which aren't usual or are special in some way, we need to be introduced to those things. If you're writing science fiction, Act 1 is often about, well, this is what's different in our futuristic world to our normal world. The status quo is what we will experience in Act 1. Now, our status quo can be ideal or less than ideal, but that's going to shift at some point during Act 1. So in some stories, your status quo will be everything is hunky-dory. That's often the case in fairy tales. Then something happens in Act 1 that throws that ordinary status quo out of order, which needs to be addressed in Act 2. And that thing is usually the inciting incident. Once the inciting incident has happened, there is typically a need for change to the status quo. The status quo by the end of Act 1 will be in need of addressing. And that will be signified by a call to adventure for the hero. The hero is the agent of change throughout the story. So, Baz, just quickly, to tell us something about the characters and the ordinary world or the status quo in Small Island.
So, I guess there's Gilbert and Hortense, who are a married couple. Queenie and Bernard, who are also a married couple. And it's kind of set partly in Jamaica in the West Indies and partly in London. There's love, snobbery, respect, colonial history. The characters are brave, good, bad and weak, hopeless at different times.
Fabulous. So we've got lots of rich story elements. I mean, Levy is remarkable in that she actually gives us not one, not two, but 4 central protagonists in Small Island. So already you've got a very rich set of characters to potentially explore. And characters are what we're going to look at next. So there's some archetypes which are useful to bear in mind before you embark on your story. So we have a protagonist here. I talked a little bit about what the protagonist does. The hero tends to set the narrative events in motion through the choices that they make. There is often an opponent or nemesis. Small Island is interesting in that the forces of opposition are less concentrated in individual characters, although there are certainly some of those, but actually the forces of opposition are societal or cultural more. There's often a mentor character who offers advice to the protagonist. Donor characters are characters who support or supply the hero with goods or services. Gatekeepers are characters who tend to block the hero from achieving their objectives. Shapeshifters are characters who we are introduced to as one thing and who later reveal themselves to be something that they are not. Often, in a typical espionage thriller, often that will be a character who you thought was working for the hero and actually turns out to be a spy or a mole for the opposition. But you do get characters sometimes that go the other way. So Han Solo in the original Star Wars is an interesting shapeshifter in that he presents himself as a mercenary throughout the story, someone who is only along for the ride to get paid, and then actually is revealed to be a decent guy who comes to the help of the hero. Tricksters and shadows, the herald and narrator, again, more archetypal functions. Tricksters who deceive the hero. Heralds and narrators are characters who move events along from an almost godlike position. So that's our Act 1 story world. Those are the functions that we're looking for in Act 1. So here's where I want you to get active. I would like you at home to start scoring on your post-it notes a specific element of language which you're going to use in Act 1. And that specific element is the noun. Now, I expect people didn't come along this morning thinking they were going to get an English comprehension lesson. So what are nouns? Nouns are the words which usually relate to specific physical things in our environment. So brick, toy, cat, book, etc. They're things that describe physical things. And there's also another kind of noun which is called a proper noun, which is the name of a person or a place. So at home, one post-it note per one noun. If you haven't got post-it notes, don't worry. Just grab a piece of paper and you're just going to put down all the nouns you need to build your story. So Baz, we're going to kind of do this for a couple of minutes while our Bravo 22 audience are working on it at home. What are the nouns that Andrea Levy needs to tell the story of Small Island?
So the names, we've got Gilbert and his wife Hortense.
Okay, so Gilbert and Hortense, who are the central couple in the narrative in many ways.
That's right, along with Queenie and Bernard.
Queenie and Bernard, who aren't exactly in opposition to Hortense and Gilbert, but offer a reflection on a different take on the society, certainly.
Yeah, there's the whole military service element.
So the army or soldier, because
Air Force.
Gilbert is a soldier, yeah?
Yeah. There is elements of prejudice in that as well, and I guess that's where the societal thing.
So that's the status quo element, that discrimination that exists exists today, but was certainly more prevalent at the time.
Yeah.
And I guess the other two big nouns for me, which are powerful, are Jamaica or the West Indies and Britain.
Yeah.
Those two locations. Although India is also a noun which he uses later. Is that not the case?
Sorry, say that again.
India also plays a role in understanding that world, albeit later in the narrative. Yeah.
Sure. Yes. Yeah.
Great. So hopefully, and here's one I prepared earlier. What we're doing is we're just going to build the nouns and just put them on one post-it, and those are the things we're going to start building our story with. So Act 1, all about nouns. Before we move on to Act 2, a couple of things just to say about the hero. Now, one of the nouns that you've generated, you might not know which one yet, is your hero. The hero, as I've said, is the character in your story who drives the narrative, who makes the choices which move the action forward. And many stories don't quite take us where they should because the hero is too passive or is the victim of events rather than the agent of change. So just talking again briefly about Act 1 of Small Island, I know Andrea Levy uses 4 protagonists. Is one of those protagonists for you, Baz, the hero, more than the others?
Yeah, I think Gilbert is more the hero. He drives the change in a number of different situations, so Gilbert, I think, is the main character, really.
Right. Okay, so again, this might not be a choice you need to make now, but as we begin to explore your story world, bear in mind which of your characters is the one which is really driving the change. Okay, let's have a little look at the world of Act 2 now. So what happens in Act 2 of a story? Well, Act 2 generally is described as being the most active of the 3 acts. Meetings and separations are absolutely central to Act 2. In fact, meetings or separations often signal, okay, we're in Act 2 now. If you're writing a love story, typically the moment when the lovers meet is the moment we have entered the world of Act 2. Similarly, lots of adventure stories will move into Act 2 when the hero has to say goodbye to his family, his or her family, or loved ones, or there is a separation, a kidnap, or an abduction of some kind. So the world of Act 2, there's a lot of movement, there's often a journey, a lot of travel, action in terms of combat sometimes, but not necessarily combat. Often Act 2, we are in a special world where different rules apply. So Back to the Future is a great example where the hero doesn't actually move physically, but he moves in time. He stays in his hometown, but he finds himself in his hometown as it was 30 years in the past. And different rules apply. Even his clothes are kind of mocked because he doesn't fit in. He's a fish out of water, and that's often the case for the hero or protagonist in Act 2. As the hero's activity sort of mounts throughout Act 2, more is at stake. So there's rising instance, rising stakes. The hero's objectives aren't achieved in Act 2. So whatever plans the hero may make, there will be opposition to those plans. There will be things that stop the hero from achieving what they want. In Act 2, we will see the status quo challenged. We will see that there is the potential that actually this less than ideal situation we're in is going to be addressed. But we also see there's a threat if the hero is not successful. So that's Act 2 in a nutshell. Another thing to think about in Act 2 is at some point, the hero will face an absolute moment of crisis where they are further away from their objective than they ever could have dreamed, where all is lost. And that's often referred to as a midpoint crisis. So the midpoint crisis in Erin Brockovich, for instance, is the moment when they decide to file their lawsuits, because suddenly the possibility of a settlement is out of the question. So it's an all or nothing moment. So as a writer, what you are looking to do, even if it seems hard, is to put your hero in absolute peril at some point in Act 2. So, activity time. What I would like you to do is grab a pen, grab a post-it or a piece of paper. I would like you to write down the verbs that you need to convey the action of Act 2 in your story. So, Baz, for Small Island, what are the kind of activities that we see, or what are the actions, what are the verbs that Andrea Levy needs in order to power her story through?
So there's one character, Michael, who meets Queenie. There's a chance encounter. And there's travel, certainly with those. Then there's the arrival of Hortense, who's also travelled. And Gilbert makes plans as well as part of this. Hortense is dissatisfied with the living arrangements and the whole situation she finds herself in, and struggles to, make herself understood, the English that she's speaking, which is a different English that she learnt in the West Indies from the English that folks are speaking.
So there's a lot. I mean, there's a lot of aspiration. There's a lot of discovery in Small Island. Not all of it good, unfortunately, for the characters. Their expectations of each other and of the world that they're moving to in search of a better life are met with a reality which is disappointing, to say the least, if not downright hostile in cases.
Sure. Just before we go on, we've got a couple of questions that have come in. There's a question from Kate. So how did Adam learn all this about storytelling? Did he study or learn through doing?
So before, I was a professional actor for years, but before that I studied film and art history, and I had to analyse a film based on the workings of a chap called Vladimir Prop, who wrote a remarkable book called Morphology of the Folktale. And what he did in that book was he essentially did everything I said you shouldn't do, which is he created a formula for telling story. And he did that by analysing 101 Russian folktales. And what that formula gave me was this interest in, well, okay, clearly there are principles behind storytelling, but how can we look at that in a way that doesn't destroy the experience? Because it's no fun for anyone to sit down and watch a movie or a TV show and know what's going to happen in advance. So that was my starting point, but it's just grown since then.
Okay. Okay, and the other one is from Matt. Who is Adam's favourite fictional hero, male or female, and why?
Okay, the classic one I go back to, I love Raymond Chandler. Philip Marlowe, the eponymous detective from Raymond Chandler's novels is remarkable, I think. But a more recent one, a fantastic book called Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine, actually, where the central protagonist, I mean, most of the drama happens in her own mind. Remarkable book. If you haven't read it, I thoroughly recommend it.
Okay, so thank you for that. All right, we'll carry on.
Great. So into the world of Act 3. So we've got our nouns, we've got our verbs. Let's have a look at the elements which typically define and characterize Act 3. So Act 3 is often about return, it's about reunion, it's about reconciliation. So the hero's been on a journey. In Act 3, they are reunited with those that they sought, or they've actually made it home. Death, rebirth, redemption are all very common features of Act 3. Sometimes the plans and the actions that we've talked about happening in Act 2, there's been a hidden element to them which the author has kept from us, and that is often revealed in Act 3. The new world rules that we were introduced to, ideally, if we're writing something with a happy ending, then the new world rules tell us that actually we've escaped the challenging rules of Act 2 and overturned the underlying dogma or principles that were supporting an unfair status quo in Act 1. So there is profound, irreversible change, and this is both external and internal. So in a great story, not only is the hero the agent of change, the hero is also the recipient of change. So the hero will have been changed by the journey in some way. And that's often where we find an emotional catharsis. In other words, we respond to the events by laughing or crying. So that's what happens in Act 3. So what I want our audience, our Bravo 22 audience to do now is jot down some adjectives. Now, adjectives are often described as the most descriptive part of language, the most emotional part of language. That's true to a certain extent. However, there are certain writers, Stephen King being one of them, who are suspicious of adjectives because potentially they can make you lazy as a writer. So, for instance, if I was to say to you, I found yesterday was really boring for me, then, okay, you get a sense of boring. However, if I was to say to you, yesterday, just for something to do, I locked myself out of the house, then actually you're not using adjectives, you're using nouns and verbs. So I think this is such an important principle for writing. Your nouns and verbs should do the heavy lifting. Now, having said that, we are going to jot down some adjectives. So what I'd like you to do is jot down the adjectives that apply to your nouns, so particularly your characters, maybe 2 or 3 adjectives for each, but also jot down the adjectives which describe the emotional journey that you want your audience to go on. Okay, so we'll quickly do that for Small Island Baz. So what are the adjectives that you think Andrea Levy needs in terms of what feelings she's trying to elicit, or what feelings she stirs in you when you think of that story, or which applies to the characters?
So there's disbelief, love, understanding. There's a level of reconciliation, and I think the characters all change.
Lovely.
In their outlook, and they show love. There is a baby that comes into this, so it's a uniting factor, I think.
Lovely, great, thank you, Baz. So there we have. Now, hopefully, you've got a nice array of language in front of you. Now, here's the thing: as I've described it, Act 3, Threeact structure sounds very straightforward. Nice linear narrative. You introduce an element that starts, something changes through action, and then we get an emotional response to that. So Threeact structure is something we're all very familiar with, even though we don't know it. And there's data which you can look for, which will tell you, well, this is how much of your story should be Act 1. Here's how much of it should be Act 2, and so on. The thing is, 3-act structure is so prevalent and we're so familiar with it that great writers play around with it. Now, Andrea Levy does this with Small Island. Each of the characters does follow a 3-act arc, but she still plays with the structure. It jumps backwards and forwards in time. One of our central protagonists, we don't even meet until 2/3 of the way through. Baz, would you say?
Yeah, I would go with that. Yeah.
And what does that? What does that do when? Because we don't meet Bernard until certainly way past the halfway point. What does keeping him from us do to you as an audience or a reader?
Yeah, it's quite a surprise, really. Yeah, there's the tension, because there seems to be something it's in the background all the time, but there is this tension that elicits from us.
Exactly. So Levy is a gifted writer. She knows that keeping a character back from us is, we're not going to feel cheated by it. Actually, when we discover that Bernard is alive, and when we hear about his experiences, and indeed watch him interact with our other 3 protagonists, it gives us a whole new freshness and vibrancy towards the end of the story. 3-act structure doesn't have to be as simple as 1, 2, 3. And great storytellers know this. So we've got some examples here of narratives that start halfway through. The Hangover starts towards the end of Act 2. Mission Impossible 3 starts midway through Act 2 at the midpoint crisis. And I don't know if anyone can recognize that image. I'd be very impressed. It's Sunset Boulevard, which is a great Billy Wilder movie, which starts at the end of Act 3 with the protagonist already dead, narrating from beyond the grave. So 3-act structure is very flexible, and actually 3-act structure is prevalent in newspapers. Most newspaper headlines are the high point of Act 2 or the midpoint crisis, and then you read the actual text to discover the background. So this is a very adaptable structure. Final point I want to leave everyone with is good stories are fractal. So that structure I've just described to you, starting with an object or a person, and then something active happens or they perform an action and there is an emotional response to it. In a good story, that's happening in every sentence, or certainly in every paragraph. So 3-act structure is fractal. If you're creating sentences or paragraphs that take a character on an activity which gives us an emotional response, you are building a powerful story. Any questions come up from anyone on the chat bar, Baz?
Yeah, so we have a question from Alice to everybody. How do you feel about stories that don't have a clear ending and leave it up to the audience stroke viewer to decide? This is from Sarah.
I mean, this is something I personally enjoy. We watched 3 billboards outside Ebbing, Missouri, my wife and I, a few weeks ago. I adored it. And then in the final 2 minutes, my wife was just like, what was the point of that? Whereas I was like, well, I don't need to see where these characters go, because actually I've got enough from this narrative. But it's a personal thing. Personally, I quite like it, but I can understand why people get frustrated by it.
Okay, another question from Matt. Would a monologue scene be easier to write than a scene?
Monologues are interesting, and I think the key principle, and I'm glad it's a great question, drama is about conflict. It's always about things being opposed. So if you're going to write a monologue, then to make it interesting, I think there has to be, which can happen. We all have conversations with ourselves, which are arguments with ourselves sometimes. So I think there's as much space for drama in a monologue as in a duologue. It's obviously easier to write it in a duologue because two opposing positions are more easily represented by two people, but it's not impossible, Matt.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, that was from Lorraine.
Sorry, Lorraine. Great question.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
So three-act structure, nouns, verbs, adjectives. This is, even if you don't produce a story which has a three-act structure, the idea of using the kind of planning that I talked about today is it makes it really easy to work out where your story goes. Before you sit down and write a 100,000-word novel, it's kind of a way of giving yourself a map of where you want to get to, what emotions you want your audience to feel, and the changes you want your characters to experience along the way. And by doing it with Post-its on a big bit of paper, you can kind of move stuff around, play with it, shift stuff, so that you're really clear on where you want to get to before you actually start the laborious task of sitting down and writing it.
Okay. So a big thank you for watching and listening, and for your questions and comments. Feedback is a growth hormone for improvement and getting others involved. So we'd love you to fill in the feedback form in the video description below, so we can continue to make Bravo 22 bigger and better. Adam will be running an interactive creative writing workshop on Zoom for up to 15 participants on Monday, 30th of November at 11 a.m. Please get in touch with us at the same email address to sign up. Thanks and bye for now. Have a great Wednesday, everyone, and get storytelling.